Hey everyone, tonight we dive into the fascinating lives and turbulent romances of several medieval queens, women who defined scandal centuries before gossip columns existed. Before settling in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy my work. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always amazing to see our worldwide audience. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle hum, and let's ease into tonight's story together. Joanna of Naples was crowned in 1343 and quickly treated royal etiquette more as a suggestion than a commandment. Where others saw duty, she saw advantage. Where others saw one husband, she saw possibilities. She married 4 times, which wasn't shocking for nobility, though Joanna had a pattern of outliving her husbands, sometimes under suspiciously swift circumstances. Her first, Andrew of Hungary, didn't survive his first year. He was found hanging from a window in what officials called an accident. Unofficially, doubts lingered. Joanna, however, showed none. One legend gave her a notorious reputation. It claimed she had a trapdoor built beneath her bed, a creative way to end the night when words failed. After an evening of royal affection, the floor supposedly opened, dropping her lover into the moat below. Dramatic, efficient, and likely the invention of a bitter gossip, yet the tale stuck. It suited her aura. Joanna ruled Naples with grace and showmanship. She wasn't reckless, just deliberate. Some found her charming, others dangerous, a few both, while stepping away carefully. She survived wars, papal fury, rival nobles, and countless rumors. Through it all, she wore her crown like her reputation, boldly and unapologetically. By the time of her death, strangled, perhaps by an ally or an enemy, it was impossible to tell. Joanna left behind power, intrigue, and enough scandal to fuel songs for centuries. She wasn't merely a queen, she was a headline before headlines existed. Eleanor of Aquitaine didn't just live in the 12th century, she ruled it. Queen of France, then of England, and mother of 2 kings, Eleanor didn't play politics, she rewrote it with wit and wine. Married to Louis VII of France at 15, she found him devout, awkward, and exuding strong. Married his cousin because he had no hobbies. Energy. Eleanor was sharp, rich, and restless. Their marriage unfolded as expected. Louis brought her along on the Second Crusade, a romantic trek through desert marches and holy relics. Eleanor brought music, fine clothes, and perhaps a fondness for her handsome uncle, the Prince of Antioch. Rumors thrived. Louis sulked. Their union quietly ended over a cold meal in Damascus. After annulment, Eleanor raced back to Aquitaine and swiftly married Henry Plantagenet, the future King of England, 11 years her junior, fiery-haired, and as wild as she liked. They had 10 children, several wars, and possibly the most passive-aggressive household in Europe. Yet Eleanor wasn't only raising kings, she was cultivating poetry. At her court in Poitiers, she fostered the art of courtly love, where noblewomen were idolized by knights full of longing and questionable restraint. Naturally, no one respected the from afar rule. There were glances, lutes, and tapestries hiding more than drafts. When Henry grew bored of fidelity and of Eleanor, she retaliated like a strategist, by helping her sons rebel. He wasn't pleased. She spent 16 years under castle arrest, using the time to write, drink wine, and plot revenge through her children. Margaret of Burgundy, on the other hand, seemed the least likely to ignite a scandal. Noble lineage, married to France's heir, elegant and well-behaved, she looked flawless on parchment. But in 1314, France learned that leaving 3 young princesses bored and unsupervised in the castle led to gossip, needlework, and extracurricular romance. Margaret was wed to Louis, the future King Louis X, a man whose charm was often likened to a plate of boiled cabbage. Their union was far from thrilling, and Margaret soon tired of pretending his bedtime lectures on tax policy were enticing. Then came the Tour de Nesle affair, a scandal with a name worthy of a medieval drama. Records claim that Margaret and her sister-in-law Blanche began meeting 2 striking Norman knights in secret. Their rendezvous spot? The Tour de Nesle, a royal tower by the Seine, secluded, slightly haunted, and conveniently private for whispered secrets and not-so-innocent encounters. The affair unraveled in spectacular fashion when the knights were identified by the embroidery on their pillowcases. Palace servants noticed the same luxury linens as those in the princess's chambers. Thus, the downfall of a queen began with medieval laundry. No spies, no poison, just poor fabric management. King Philip IV, Margaret's father-in-law, was furious. The knights were tortured and executed with grim ceremony. Margaret herself was imprisoned at Château Gallard, a fortress as gloomy as its name suggests. 2 years later, she died there, whether by illness, suffocation, or her husband's eagerness for a fresh start remains uncertain. History, ever discreet, never confirmed if the pillowcases were returned. Her crime wasn't treason or witchcraft, it was simply charm in the wrong tower, with the wrong men, on the wrong sheets. And in medieval France, that was fatal. Isabella of France had every royal luxury, noble birth, wealth, and exquisite shoes, but not a happy marriage. She wed Edward II of England in 1308, a tall and handsome king who preferred the company of his male favorites to that of his queen. From day one, Isabella had a rival, Piers Gaveston, a stylish knight with the tact of a spoiled cat. Edward showered him with titles, jewels, and affection. At the coronation banquet, Gaveston sparkled in more jewels than Isabella herself. She noticed. Eventually, nobles tired of his arrogance and executed him. Isabella may have sighed, or smiled. But then came Hugh Despenser, greedier and crueler, who seized her lands, insulted her openly, and treated the throne like his playground. By 1326, Isabella had endured enough. She fled to France with her son, the future Edward III, under the guise of diplomacy. There she met Roger Mortimer, a rebellious noble with ambition and a conveniently empty ring finger. Together, they launched an invasion of England. Yes, a queen invaded her own kingdom, with a lover and teenage heir beside her. It worked. Edward was captured and dethroned. Rumors soon followed. Edward II had died in prison under mysterious conditions, some claiming a red-hot poker was involved. Likely fiction, though Isabella's innocence was questionable. She ruled as regent beside Mortimer until her son grew weary of their control and overthrew them both. Isabella spent her later years in comfortable confinement. She entered history as a wronged wife and left it as a legend. Agnes of Navarre was born into poetry, politics, and thinly veiled hostility. The daughter of a king and sister to a troubadour queen, she grew up where charm was power and gossip could kill. She married James IV of Aragon's grandson, only to discover her new husband was more unstable than romantic, prone to night terrors and accusing curtains of treason. Agnes did what many noblewomen with no escape did, she looked elsewhere for affection. Quietly, frequently, and with variety. Her rumored lovers included knights, poets, courtiers, even a monk with shaky vows. Elegant and witty, she mastered flirtation better than Latin, useful, but dangerous. Secrets in stone castles never lasted. Whispers spread, deaths followed. A rival here, a gossiping maid there, even a courtier who fell into the moat. Whether coincidence or design, no one knew, but the kitchens began locking spices when she passed. Her husband eventually died, miraculously not by her hand, and Agnes retired to a convent. Not from guilt, but tradition. It was where noblewomen went to read, pray, and outlive their scandals. She never remarried, perhaps for peace, perhaps for lack of volunteers. Agnes left no heirs, only stories, rumors whispered through corridors and warnings woven into love songs that ended too soon. Joanna of Castile was royalty by birth and a cautionary tale by destiny. She married Philip the Handsome of Burgundy, his nickname, not exaggeration. With golden hair, strong legs, and a knowing grin, he was the medieval ideal of temptation. Joanna fell deeply, disastrously in love. Their union was fiery until it burned. Philip was charming, ambitious, and allergic to fidelity. His affairs grew bold, Joanna's temper grew legendary. Her jealous outbursts and accusations became infamous. Some say she even resorted to hair-pulling diplomacy. Then, unexpectedly, Philip dropped dead in 1506, allegedly after drinking cold water post-tennis. Yes, that was the official explanation. Even by 16th century standards, the story was suspiciously vague. Joanna was devastated, utterly and completely. Not the kind of sorrow soothed by black veils and prayer, but the kind that had her digging up the coffin and taking it along for months. She ordered it opened repeatedly to ensure Philip's body was still there, kissed his lifeless lips, and forbade any women from approaching the corpse, just in case. Even in death, Philip remained a flight risk. Joanna roamed Castile with the coffin, stopping at monasteries, demanding to sleep beside it, and according to rumor, perhaps more than that. Chroniclers grew discreet at that part. Whether out of respect or discomfort is unclear. Whispers spread, courtiers panicked. Her father Ferdinand eventually declared her insane and confined her to a convent for the next 46 years. A record, even for overly devoted queens. Was Joanna truly mad, or merely a broken-hearted woman clinging to the man who betrayed her most? Historians still debate it. Either way, she's remembered less for her reign than for her romance with the dead. First, a clarification. Catherine the Great did not die during an encounter with a horse. The fact that this rumor exists says enough about how powerful and controversial she became. Though technically post-medieval, she earns her place here for sheer scandal volume. Born a minor German princess, Catherine married into Russian royalty and quickly discovered her husband Peter III was more of a man-child with toy soldiers than a czar. He preferred drills and Prussia to ruling, or to her. So Catherine, as any clever woman in an icy marriage might, looked elsewhere. She took lovers, many of them. Officers, poets, nobles, maybe even a craftsman or two. Some young, some brilliant, one barely 18 when she was 60. Instead of reckless, she was strategic, rewarding devotion with titles and estates, an imperial loyalty program. Impress her, and you earned wealth. Fail, and you found yourself exiled. After her death, malicious enemies or bored aristocrats spread that infamous horse tale, ridiculous and biologically impossible, yet persistent. Why? Because Catherine ruled alone. She reformed laws, defied the church, and crushed revolts. People couldn't stomach a woman wielding power, so they reduced her legacy to absurd gossip. In truth, she died of a stroke in bed, no livestock involved. But the myth endured because scandal always outruns fact. Catherine may not have ridden a horse, but she certainly rode history like it belonged to her. If you thought medieval queens merely embroidered by candlelight, meet Fredegund of Neustria, a woman devoted to royal duty, personal dignity, and the occasional neck stabbing. Once a servant, she rose with alarming speed, thanks to either dazzling charm or an increasing body count, possibly both. She caught the eye of King Chilperic I, who conveniently lost his first wife soon after. His second, Galswintha, met a similar fate, strangled in bed. Fredegund denied involvement, maintaining a perfect "Yes, I'm holding a pillow, but that proves nothing" tone. As queen, she only grew bolder. She slept with a knife under her pillow, literally. To her, bedtime was potential combat. A rival insulted her? Poisoned. A bishop offended her? Vanished. A gossiping servant? Found dead. Her feud with Brunhilde of Austrasia became legendary, a decades-long war of revenge, politics, and murder. Fredegund even sent an assassin to kill Brunhilde's son during Mass. Subtlety was not her gift. After her husband's mysterious assassination, she ruled as regent for their son Clohard II, crushing enemies and handling diplomacy with equal efficiency, and likely another hidden dagger. Despite her bloody resume, she somehow died peacefully in bed, which feels like a clerical mistake in her story. Fredegund wasn't just a woman with knives, she was the knife, sharp, cold, and unstoppable. And Bullen wasn't born to rule, she was born to be remembered. Intelligent, magnetic, and fluent in the art of the knowing glance, she stormed into Henry VIII's court like a spark in a powder room. Not conventionally beautiful, but striking in her confidence and wit, she captured a king's attention and never let go. Henry, already married to Catherine of Aragon, became obsessed. And refused to be his mistress, she wanted a crown. He obliged, rewriting England's religion to have her. The Church of England was born out of infatuation and political chaos. As queen, and was outspoken, clever, and divisive. Half the court adored her, the other half plotted her downfall. Her teasing humor delighted Henry, until it didn't. When she gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, instead of a son, the king's affection soured. Soon came accusations, adultery, witchcraft, incest, none credible. But Henry needed an exit, and was arrested, tried in farce, and executed by a French swordsman specially imported for the task. Even her death was polished, and lost her head but not her legend. She remains the queen who dared to say no before saying yes, who reached for power in a world that punished ambition. Some queens ruled by seduction, some by scandal, and ruled by nerve, and then there was Christina of Denmark, who ruled by wit, survival, and the ability to deliver a verbal dagger without smudging her lipstick. Christina of Denmark was born into Danish royalty in 1521 and married off early, typical procedure for the 16th century, when noble girls were essentially velvet-draped political treaties. Her husband, the Duke of Milan, died soon after, leaving her widowed at 16, which, for an aristocratic woman, was almost ideal. Freedom, wealth, and no lectures about governance over dinner. Then came Henry VIII, freshly single, notoriously impatient, and already one decapitated wife into his romantic resume. England wasn't even done cleaning up the mess from Anne Boleyn when he sent a painter to capture Christina's portrait and gauge her potential as wife number 3. Christina, shrewd and disinterested in becoming another casualty of royal affection, famously replied, "If I had 2 heads, I'd gladly offer one to the King of England." That wasn't just a rejection, it was an immortal burn worthy of engraving in stone. Henry, unsurprisingly, didn't appreciate the wit but still pursued her, because nothing says royal charm like ignoring clear rejection and continuing negotiations anyway. Christina, valuing her continued existence, politely declined and later married a far safer duke, the kind who didn't execute breakfast companions. She ruled wisely, lived comfortably, and most importantly, kept her head. Later, she served as regent, dabbled in military affairs, and continued collecting portraits, proof that admiration is best enjoyed without proposals from sword-happy kings. Christina never wore England's crown, but her line became legend. Sometimes power isn't about claiming the throne, it's about dodging it gracefully and leaving historians laughing for centuries. Centuries later, Maria of Portugal followed a familiar royal path, married off young to Alfonso XI of Castile, a war hero with the ego of a kingdom and a very public mistress, Leonor de Guzman. Alfonso adored Leonor openly, gifting her comfort, influence, and 10 illegitimate children, while Maria, the legitimate queen, was left with a single heir, Peter, later known as Peter the Cruel. After Alfonso's death, Maria returned to Portugal, fiercely protective of her son and determined to reclaim dignity through him. Historians describe her as overprotective. Others suggest her attachment bordered on obsessive. When Peter fell in love with Inés de Castro, a lady of lesser nobility, Maria's disapproval was immediate, perhaps out of pride, or jealousy, or both. According to darker rumors, she encouraged Inés's assassination. Peter's revenge became infamous. He exhumed Inés's body, crowned her queen, and forced nobles to kiss her decaying hand, a macabre gesture of grief and fury. Whether Maria truly ordered the murder remains uncertain, but her name lingered in whispered blame for decades. In her later years, Maria withdrew from court, possibly styling herself Empress in solitude. Madness was never proven, but melancholy certainly was. She died surrounded not by affection but by echoes of intrigue and regret, remembered less as a queen than as a mother whose love blurred into obsession. And then there was Olga of Kiev, a ruler who redefined vengeance itself. When her husband, Prince Igor, was slain by the Drevlians in 945, they made the fatal error of proposing she marry their prince, believing the widow of the man they just dismembered would welcome matrimony. Olga smiled, agreed to consider it, and then unleashed a masterclass in poetic revenge. First, she invited the Drevlians' envoys to her court, then had their boats carried into a pit and buried alive. Next, she summoned another group of emissaries, offering them a bathhouse before talks, then locked the doors and burned it down. Still unsatisfied, she hosted a funeral feast for Igor, got the guests drunk, and slaughtered around 5,000 of them. Her campaign's finale was nothing short of genius. She demanded tribute, 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from each Drevian home. When they complied, Olga tied sulfur-soaked cloth to each bird, lit them, and released them. The flaming birds returned to their nests, setting the entire city ablaze in one synchronized inferno. It was less diplomacy and more divine retribution, a fiery warning never to underestimate a grieving queen. Olga didn't just avenge her husband, she turned destruction into an art form. Olga eventually converted to Christianity and, in one of history's strangest plot twists, became a canonized saint. Proof, perhaps, that time has a wicked sense of humor. One day you're burning cities with pigeons, the next you're immortalized as a paragon of virtue. Olga didn't bother with subtle intrigue or whispered poison. She simply erased her enemies, then ascended to sainthood. Centuries later, Lucrezia Borgia never technically wore a crown, yet her influence eclipsed that of many who did. Born in 1480 into the infamous Borgia family, a red flag in itself, she was the daughter of Pope Alexander VI. Yes, a pope. Celibacy was more of a suggestion than a rule for the Borgias, whose family values included ambition, favoritism, and a flair for scandal. Lucrezia's marriages were political chess moves. Her husbands often met abrupt, unpleasant ends or vanished into convenient obscurity. One unfortunate man, Giovanni Sforza, was publicly humiliated when the Borgias annulled their marriage, citing a lack of consummation, essentially declaring him too dull for Lucrezia's tastes. Then came the whispers, a ring filled with poison, an affair with her brother Cesare, a secret child whose father might have been the Pope himself. Truth and rumor blended until her life resembled a Renaissance soap opera. Whether any of it was true hardly mattered. Lucrezia was captivating, educated, multilingual, magnetic, and more than capable of turning courtly gatherings into legendary nights of politics, poetry, and perhaps a touch of murder. Later, as Duchess of Ferrara, she reinvented herself entirely, gracious, cultured, a patron of the arts. It was almost disappointing, like watching a panther take up embroidery. Still, the legend endured. The name, Borgia, remains shorthand for beauty wrapped in danger, and Lucrezia its most elegant phantom. Her true power wasn't poison, it was mystery. And history has always been addicted to that. Far to the east, Wu Zetian began her climb to power the traditional way, as a teenage concubine to Emperor Taizong of Tang. She was one among many, observant, courteous, and already plotting several moves ahead. When the emperor died, Wu was sent to a Buddhist convent, as was custom for childless concubines. She meditated briefly, then engineered her return by captivating the new ruler, her late emperor's son, Gaozong. Yes, she seduced her former stepson, and yes, it caused the palace to implode with gossip. Once back at court, Wu wasted no time securing control. Rivals vanished, opposition was silenced, and her influence grew to eclipse the emperor's. After Gaozong's death, she did what no woman before or since dared. She crowned herself Emperor of China, not Empress, but Emperor, in her own right. The Confucian establishment had collective heart failure. Wu did not blink. Under her reign, the empire flourished. Agriculture expanded, education strengthened, and civil reforms took root. So did the rumors, affairs, assassinations, hidden orgies, and murder by golden box. To her critics, a woman's competence could only mean witchcraft. Wu ignored them all. She ruled for over 4 decades, dying peacefully in her 80s, a feat almost mythical in imperial China. Ruthless? Perhaps. Brilliant? Absolutely. She didn't just break the system, she rewrote it in silk and blood. And then came Queen Tamar of Georgia, presiding over what historians would later call the nation's golden age, a reign of faith, power, and poetry, where politics and passion intertwined as seamlessly as legend itself. Crowned King of Kings. Yes, king. In 1184, Tamar refused to be a queen in name only. She ruled as the supreme monarch, not a ceremonial partner beside a husband. When her nobles tried to secure her a politically safe marriage, she graciously chose a hard-drinking Russian prince with dubious manners, married him, and swiftly banished him when he misbehaved, which was often. After that, Tamar reigned alone. Georgia expanded its lands, thrived in trade, and produced enough poetry to drown the Black Sea in verse about valor, love, and the divine brilliance of the queen's cheekbones. Now, here's where things take a more intriguing, and slightly scandalous, turn. Her court poet, Shota Rustaveli, wrote The Knight in the Panther's Skin, an epic filled with adoration for a queen who ruled all men, inspired unshakable loyalty, and bore more than a passing resemblance to Tamar herself. While it proves nothing, whispers persisted that the queen's admirers, both male and female, found inspiration not only in her politics but in her presence. Rumors of private gatherings, secret companions, and long conversations far removed from matters of state drift through medieval chronicles like perfume no one dares name. Despite such tales, Tamar was canonized as a saint after her death. No small feat for a ruler who led crusades, crushed uprisings, and legend says sent wayward lovers off to monasteries for spiritual reflection. She passed peacefully, surrounded by loyal nobles and enough sanctity to turn gossip into myth. Tamar didn't need scandal to be immortal. But the hint of it, that's what keeps her radiant through history. And if you think Christmas ended on December 25th, medieval folk would have laughed you straight out of the tavern. Back then, the season stretched for 12 full days, from the Nativity on December 25th to the Feast of the Epiphany on January 6th, each day carrying its own rituals, meanings, and excuses for indulgence. The first day, Christmas itself, was solemn yet joyous. After weeks of Advent, basically a medieval diet of restraint and prayer, came a tidal wave of feasting and celebration. The poor dined on meat, the rich hosted banquets that could drain a monastery's pantry. Ale flowed freely. The 12 days weren't just a dinner party. They were a spiritual and social spectacle. Each day honored a different saint. December 26th, St. Stephen's Day, was for charity to the poor, an early form of Boxing Day with more devotion and fewer sales. December 28th marked Holy Innocents' Day, honoring the children killed by King Herod, during which some traditions even let children rule the household. Predictably, chaos followed. By January 1st, the Feast of the Circumcision, most people were too full and too drunk to do much beyond mumbling hymns and grabbing another goose leg. But they held out until January 6th, Epiphany, celebrating the visit of the Magi with masks, disguises, and role reversals where peasants played kings and kings pretended to laugh. Christmas, to them, wasn't a single morning, it was nearly 2 weeks of piety, revelry, and delightful disorder. And if you weren't still celebrating well into the new year, were you really part of the feast? Forget plastic trees and store-bought Santas. A medieval Christmas looked more like a forest festival than a living room postcard. Ivy, holly, bay, and mistletoe decorated halls, their evergreen resilience symbolizing eternal life, borrowed from old pagan solstice rites. If it stayed green in December, it got hung on a wall. The real showpiece, though, was the boar's head, both meal and centerpiece. Imagine a roasted pig's head, apple in mouth, paraded into a great hall to the sound of minstrels singing the Boar's Head Carol. Nothing says Merry Christmas quite like that unblinking gaze. Noble celebrations filled vast echoing halls with lutes, pipes, laughter, and the occasional inebriated monk joining the chorus. Floors were strewn with rushes, walls draped with tapestries, and the air thick with roast, spice, and humanity. Without Christmas trees, which didn't appear widely in Europe until much later, people got creative. Holly and ivy weren't random decor. They were sacred symbols of endurance and renewal, reminders that even in the dead of winter, life persisted. Holly, with its spiked leaves, was believed to represent the crown of thorns worn by Christ. Ivy, which wrapped and clung tightly, symbolized the soul's steadfast reliance on God, a kind of sacred houseplant arrangement. Mistletoe, however, was the mischievous one, tied to fertility and Old Norse tales. It didn't always earn church approval, yet that never stopped medieval merrymakers from hanging it over their doors. Anyone caught beneath it could be kissed, often without consent. The clergy frowned on that part, but honestly, The medieval church frowned on nearly everything, and people still went right on doing them. Step into a grand hall at Christmastide, and it would feel half chapel, half forest feast. Evergreen garlands along the beams, candles flickering on long oak tables, meats roasting in the firelight, and someone trying to remember which corner held the mistletoe and which hid the chamber pot. In those centuries, Christmas dinner wasn't merely a meal, it was an edible proclamation of faith, fortune, and excess. Nobles used the table to flaunt their riches with dishes so elaborate they bordered on absurd. Peasants, meanwhile, savored their one yearly taste of meat. Everyone devoured like there'd be no tomorrow, which, given the plague and famine rate, wasn't unreasonable. The centerpiece was often the boar's head, yes, again, but that was only the opening act. Peacocks arrived roasted and redressed in their jeweled feathers, swans basted in spice glazes, pies large enough to conceal live birds, and occasionally did. Stews thick with roots, uneven loaves, sweetmeats, porridges, and subtleties, those intricate sculptures made of marzipan, sugar, or dough molded into castles, angels, and dragons, filled the tables. Medieval cooking wasn't exactly shy, and then there were the drinks. Warm spiced ale and cider passed from hand to hand in shared bowls. The toast meant, "Be well," though the results were usually less than healthy. Another favorite, Hippocras, was a honey-sweetened wine served hot with spice. These weren't just festive, they were practical. After weeks of fasting, your stomach needed courage to face all that goose fat and barley bread. But make no mistake, these feasts were orchestrated performances, not casual picnics. The highest guests dined first and sat closest to the warmth, while those of lesser rank waited their turn. Monks kept equality at their tables, but their food was spectacularly bland. Even so, many monasteries suspended their vegetarian vows for the holiday, because nothing celebrates the nativity like lamb shank and wine. Food was central to Christmas because such abundance was rare. For most of the year, people survived on porridge, beans, and cabbage. Christmas was when everyone silently agreed, yes, let's all eat until we regret it. And one feast was never enough. Each of the 12 days had its own table, host, and sometimes theme. By Epiphany, most were spiritually refreshed, emotionally drained, and physically swollen. If you think modern holidays get messy with family squabbles and dry turkey, the Middle Ages would have said, "Hold my wassail." Enter the Lord of Misrule, a real title, often granted to a fool, servant, or mischievous cleric chosen to oversee the Christmas chaos. His job was to flip the world upside down and make decency optional. The Lord of Misrule was the living spirit of holiday madness. For 12 days he might preside over mock trials for ridiculous offenses like sausage theft or bad hats. His court brimmed with jesters, musicians, and agents of mischief. It was sanctioned mayhem wrapped in bells and candlelight. During his reign, hierarchy dissolved, servants gave commands, students punished teachers, choirbas dressed as bishops. It was half carnival, half spiritual lesson in humility, and fully unforgettable. Medieval folk believed that briefly turning society upside down actually helped keep order the rest of the year. 12 days of chaos meant 11 months of calm. Even monasteries weren't spared. Some churches crowned a boy bishop on St. Nicholas Day, December 6th, letting a child lead processions and deliver mock sermons. The ritual wasn't just for humor, it symbolized that innocent wisdom was closer to divine truth. Still, watching a 12-year-old struggle with incarnation was comedy gold. The Lord of Misrule fueled the fun with dancing, drinking, and outlandish disguises. Nobles donned animal masks, swapped genders, or dressed as saints, devils, and biblical figures all in one evening, a medieval mashup of Halloween and Christmas. The church had mixed feelings. Clergy often tried to curb the wildness, but they also knew hard lives needed release. A little disorder kept the peace, and even bishops enjoyed a good fruitcake. So, while we fret about family dinners and burnt turkeys, medieval people had a literal chaos manager running their holidays. His job? Make Christmas as loud, strange, and gleefully irreverent as possible. If medieval carolers appeared at your doorstep today, you'd likely call security. Back then, caroling, was less angelic singing and more organized rowdiness, villagers demanding food or ale in exchange for not causing trouble. Imagine tipsy peasants waving mugs and maybe a goose while shouting tunes. Originally, carol meant a circle dance with singing, and many early carols were bawdy folk songs later rewritten by the church into pious hymns. But everyone knew singing was only half the fun. Collecting your reward was the real goal. Wassailing turned this into festive extortion. Groups roamed from house to house, toasting with spiced cider or ale and expecting food, drink, or coins in return. Refuse, and they might sing louder, or improvise a verse about your stinginess. They were basically medieval Yelp reviewers with bells. This behavior wasn't condemned, it was encouraged. Nobles kept food ready for passing singers, while peasants cherished the rare excuse to approach their social betters, and maybe snag a meat pie. People believed feeding carolers brought blessings for the coming year. Slamming the door risked bad luck, or worse, poor harvests. The songs themselves varied from nativity stories to saintly tributes to straight-up drinking anthems. Favorites included Bring Us in Good Ale, self-explanatory, and the Boar's Head Carol, sung as a roasted pig's head entered the hall like a heroic trophy. So while modern caroling is quaint and polite, medieval caroling was equal parts ritual, pub crawl, and musical blackmail. It often lasted well into January, so long as the ale held out. And before cozy fireplaces or cinnamon candles, there was the Yule log, a massive timber dragged into the hall and lit with great ceremony. The log was so large that one end usually stuck out of the hearth. They'd simply push it in as it burned, like a slow-roasting symbol of joy. It wasn't just warmth, it was protection and fortune. People thought it scared away spirits, brought luck, and even foretold the future from how the fire danced. Ashes were scattered on fields for fertility or kept to guard homes from lightning, because in medieval logic, magic and science were the same thing. The Yule log was lit using embers from the previous year's fire, a gesture of continuity and good fortune. Starting fresh fire meant bad luck, like resetting your destiny. Logs were chosen carefully, sometimes entire trees decorated with ribbons or soaked in wine, expected to burn through all 12 nights. If it went out early, bad omen, hope your livestock survived. Gathering by the log was a highlight. People drank, sang, told tales, and roasted chestnuts as the blaze glowed. Children were warned about creatures climbing down chimneys. Adults swapped gossip over mugs of wassail, and laughter filled the hall. Though the custom survives now mostly as a dessert roll, the Yule log once embodied warmth, unity, and the sacred suspension of rules that made Christmas magical. In modern terms, it was medieval Netflix and a roaring fire, just with fewer marshmallows and a lot more goats. Gift giving back then would seem almost unrecognizable today. Wrapping paper, bows, and shopping lists didn't exist. Presents were modest and symbolic, often exchanged on New Year's or Epiphany, not Christmas Day. Nobles might gift falcons or illuminated books. Servants received gloves, bread, or maybe a coin. Children got nuts, apples, or a hand-carved toy. No gold-plated consoles, just heartfelt simplicity. Games, though, were another matter. The 12 days overflowed with noisy fun, from dice and cards to outdoor contests that ended with someone in a ditch. Favorites included Hoodman Blind, Blind Man's Bluff, Hot Cockles, Don't Ask, and plenty of wrestling. If it involved laughter, rivalry, or minor bruises, it made the cut. Even nobles turned to chess or Alkirk, an ancestor of checkers. In the end, the medieval Christmas spirit was clear: feast hard, play harder, and remember that for 12 fleeting days, the world could turn wonderfully upside down. Even during games, people rarely strayed far from their ale. Chessboards were more often found beneath the tables than on top of them. For those craving drama, there were mummers' plays, masked performances by traveling troupes of amateur actors. These chaotic, semi-improvised shows mixed themes of death and rebirth, saints, dragons, and occasionally a dancing devil. Think of them as medieval soap operas, only written by your inebriated uncle. Alongside them came riddles and guessing contests, a noble court favorite. The losers might have to drink, recite a humiliating verse, or don something ridiculous, like a pig's snout tied on with twine, which, honestly, still beats modern office parties. So while Christmas gifts were simple, the spirit of humor and playfulness made the season feel rich in other ways. Games and laughter shared space with devotion and roast swan, and often stole the spotlight. Amid all the feasting, ale-fueled singing, and men in goat masks proclaiming themselves kings for a day, there remained the solemn heart of Christmas, the birth of Christ. In the medieval world, the holiday was both holy day and holiday, and nothing embodied its sacred side more than midnight Massachusetts. As bells rang across frosted rooftops and snowy fields, villagers, nobles, and monks trudged through the cold to attend a candlelit service. Inside, incense filled the air, evergreen garlands lined the walls, and flickering candles turned stone into gold. A Latin choir might sing, unless, of course, the boys were hungover from sneaking ale. 3 masses were held that day: at midnight for Christ's eternal birth, at dawn for his birth from Mary, and at noon for his birth in believers' hearts. Triple the meaning, and triple the time on cold stone benches. These services were long and solemn. Gregorian chants, Latin readings, and processions stretched endlessly, leaving many illiterate attendees to nod politely and wonder which saint to focus on. Still, everyone came. Even peasants who rarely stepped inside a church would gather, if only to glimpse something divine between rounds of revelry. Nativity plays often followed, featuring Mary, Joseph, angels, shepherds, and occasionally a real baby, or if none was available, a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. Though intended to be reverent, they usually ended in laughter when someone forgot a line or a sheep wandered off stage. In a harsh and unpredictable world, midnight mass offered something transcendent: peace, awe, and a spark of light in the year's darkest night. It grounded the chaos, along with one last mug of mulled wine. After 12 days of music, feasts, and mischief, the season ended with the Feast of the Epiphany on January 6th, celebrating the arrival of the Magi and their gifts to Christ. For medieval folk, it also marked the day you stopped pretending that eating roast swan in your underwear while watching jesters was normal. Epiphany was a grand occasion, nearly rivaling Christmas itself. Churches overflowed with incense, chants, and processions. Homes were blessed with chalk and water for protection. It was the final spark of joy before winter's long monotony returned. Yet the mayhem wasn't done. In many places, the 12th night celebrations were the most raucous of all, filled with music, masks, gifts, and theatrical madness. A king and queen of the bean were crowned after someone found a hidden bean or pea in a cake. The lucky pair ruled the night, giving absurd orders while wearing paper crowns. It was part comedy, part social release, and part excuse to shout, "All hail the pea queen!" Feasts overflowed with roasted meats, rich pies, and the famed 12th cake, the ancestor of today's king cake, packed with fruit, sugar, and surprises best left unidentified. By then, most people were full, sleepy, and slightly hungover, dreading the fasting season ahead. For children, Epiphany was often gift day, reflecting the Magi's offerings. For adults, it was the last chance to flirt with jesters or wear devil masks to church. When the feast ended, decorations came down, the Yule log was extinguished, and its ashes saved for luck. Then life resumed, work, prayer, and the constant struggle to avoid dying of dysentery. With the medieval Christmas season behind them, 12 days of reverence, mischief, and communal revelry, people returned to their routines. Yet what a spectacle it had been! Long before carols, Yule logs, or gingerbread men, there was Saturnalia, the ancient Roman festival so wild and topsy-turvy it made any modern office party seem tame. Dedicated to Saturn, god of time and agriculture, it celebrated reversal, chaos, and joy, beginning each year on December 17th. Originally a solemn religious rite at the Temple of Saturn, where priests unbound the statue and offered sacrifices, Saturnalia eventually grew into a week-long spree of sanctioned disorder. Shops closed, schools paused, the courts went silent, and even the Senate avoided showing up. The empire took a rare collective breath, then plunged headlong into gambling, feasting, and cross-dressing. The Romans adored role reversals. Masters served slaves, senators wore silly hats, and everyone traded stiff white togas for colorful party robes called synthesis. Even the rigid class system loosened for a week. Freedmen mocked patrons, women acted out men's roles in public skits, and slaves sat at banquets, while their masters poured wine and played the fool. It was chaos wrapped in ceremony, a divine joke sanctioned by Saturn himself. Homes and streets bloomed with garlands, wreaths, and candles. Music, laughter, and the clatter of dice replaced hymns. Gift-giving was central: wax figurines, witty trinkets, and small charms called sigillaria, the Roman version of a mischievous secret Santa. Yet beneath the revelry lay purpose. Saturnalia was Rome's annual pressure release, a pause from duty that let citizens breathe, mock authority, and remember that time ultimately answered to Saturn, not Caesar. For slaves, it was the only week they could recline, drink wine, and issue orders without fear. The master's act of serving wasn't just symbolic, it was ritualized inversion. Slaves could dress like free men, joke with their owners, and dine at the same table, sometimes even leading it. Some households crowned a king of Saturnalia, often a slave, who commanded absurd tasks: sing to a goat, drink upside down, or dance until collapse. A parody of power, yes, but also a glimpse of freedom. The ritual carried catharsis and commentary. In a society built on hierarchy, it reminded everyone how fragile power really was. When the week ended, order snapped back, but for those fleeting days laughter replaced fear, and satire stood in for obedience. It was Rome's way of coping, a controlled rebellion dressed as a party. During Saturnalia, breaking the rules wasn't just accepted, it was expected. Gambling, normally banned, became the season's heartbeat. Men, women, and even children rolled dice or knucklebones, wagering coins, food, or dares. Slaves, too, were allowed to play, and occasionally won big, sometimes at their master's expense. Taverns overflowed, homes turned into gambling dens, and the sound of dice rattling across marble echoed through every street. Playing was more than luck, it was defiance, a declaration that for 1 week, even Jupiter couldn't tell you what to do. And of course, there was wine, flowing freely, laced with honey and spices until it was more potion than drink. Toasts were made not to moderation but to Saturn, to liberty, and to the ceiling for good measure. Public singing, drunken dancing, and ivy wreaths were all part of the show. Saturnalia gave Romans permission to drop their stoic masks and embrace joy without restraint, a week when even the most proper citizen could stumble home in bright robes, grinning like a god of misrule himself. Senators performed poorly in public games, while women told bawdy jokes and received applause. Chastity, seriousness, and self-control were tossed aside with the same enthusiasm as yesterday's bread crusts. Some called Saturnalia the best days of the year because it allowed people to be their truest selves, messy, loud, emotional, and slightly off-key. The wild behavior wasn't sinful, it was necessary. Just as the land needed rest, so did the Roman spirit. For that week, irresponsibility was celebrated, gloriously and unapologetically. What was the worst that could happen? You returned to being a respectable citizen the following week. At the festival's heart was a crowned fool, the king of Saturnalia, sometimes called the Lord of Misrule. Often chosen from the lowest ranks or even among slaves, this temporary monarch oversaw festivities like a drunken god wearing a laurel wreath. The role was simple: command chaos. Orders could be ridiculous: dance like a donkey, sing love songs to fruit bowls, or recite Cicero while hiccuping. Guests had to comply or risk public ridicule. This was more than a gag. It was ritualized subversion. The king embodied Saturn's spirit: freedom, fertility, disorder. By placing the least powerful person in charge, Romans symbolically inverted the social order. The master became servant, the fool sovereign, and dignity held no sway. The king's selection often involved hiding a bean or coin in a cake. Whoever found it became monarch for the night, a tradition that would echo through Europe in the king cake custom. Originally, the role may have held darker undertones tied to fertility rites. But by the imperial period, the worst outcome was a hangover and embarrassing stories. When the festival ended, the king's reign concluded, the crown was removed, servants returned to their duties, and absurdity faded, leaving only laughter, leftover wine, and perhaps a bruised ego. For a brief moment, a slave could command a senator, and all of Rome cheered. Gift giving, too, was unique. Wax or clay figurines, joke items, trinkets, or small treats like nuts and pastries, called sigillaria, were central. Some gifts flattered, some mocked, and a few were last-minute grabs from the market. Phallic charms were common, meant to bring fertility, protection, and laughter. Candles symbolized light returning after winter's darkest days, and witty verses often accompanied presents. Children were indulged, allowed to play, gamble, joke, and even boss adults. Though modest, gifts carried meaning. A sigillarium reflected humor, affection, or the giver's creativity. Aristocrats sometimes included favors or coins for clients, blending generosity with tradition. Gift exchanges typically occurred around December 19th, with mild stress and occasional passive-aggressive responses. During Saturnalia, Romans abandoned their usual elegance. Crisp white togas were replaced by colorful synthesis robes, pallias hats symbolized freedom, and ivy and holly adorned both homes and people. Everything from attire to decor reflected the festival's irreverent, joyful spirit, where chaos and celebration ruled. Saturnalia wasn't merely chaotic, it had a striking aesthetic. Streets and homes were festooned with greenery, candles, and colorful decorations, yet mischief flowed just beneath the surface. Romans seized the weak to mock the gods, the Senate, and each other, parodying sacred symbols with humor. Processions featured men dressed as Jupiter or Bacchus behaving like drunken fools, and one year even included a donkey wearing a laurel crown, because Saturn willed it. Religious norms were turned upside down. Saturn's statue, typically bound in wool to signify restraint, was unbound during the festival, mirroring the liberation of people from work, roles, and daily life's grind. Songs and chants filled the streets with a mix of joy and gentle irreverence, ranging from silly drinking tunes to playful parodies of traditional hymns. It was a sacred festival of unholiness. Order mocked, rules relaxed, and everyone engaged in playful pretense, not to destroy society, but to remind themselves that life need not always be serious. Even in the heart of the empire, joy had its place. Beneath the chaos were serious ancient roots. Saturnalia arose from agricultural and religious traditions honoring Saturn, god of farming, time, and generations. He symbolized a mythical golden age of equality, peace, and plenty, when humanity lived freely without kings, slaves, or war. By the time Rome's Temple of Saturn was built in 497 BC, the Golden Age was gone, but once a year, people tried to reclaim it. Saturnalia was a ritual reenactment of that ideal. For 1 week, hierarchy paused, wealth shared, and laughter replaced law. It was spiritual nostalgia as much as revelry. The festival began with sacrifices at Saturn's temple, followed by a public banquet open to all. Priests unbound Saturn's statue, symbolizing the loosening of cosmic and social order, granting the people divine permission to indulge fully. The timing, late December, near the winter solstice, celebrated the sun's return with light, fire, greenery, and joy. Candles were not mere decorations. They symbolized hope and rebirth. Saturnalia, though boisterous and irreverent, served as a fleeting glimpse of a freer, fairer world. When early Christians established Christmas, they faced a challenge. Saturnalia was too popular. Preaching humility was hard when neighbors wore ivy crowns, gambled, and handed out nuts. The church adapted, borrowing Saturnalia customs, gift-giving, greenery, candles, playful hats, role reversals, and communal feasting gradually merged into Christmas traditions. Even the Lord of Misrule and Epiphany gift customs trace back to these Roman practices. Eventually, the chaos ended. Dice stilled, wine cups drained, and the king of Saturnalia stumbled off his throne. Order snapped back, masters reclaimed authority, slaves returned to duties, colorful robes gave way to togas, and seriousness returned like lights switched on at a teenager's party. Saturnalia had released the pressure beneath the empire's rigid structure, a ritual venting of social tension. Its conclusion symbolized Saturn returning to his bindings, and the brief interlude of joyous disorder was over. The god's statue at the temple was once again bound with woolen cords, signaling the restoration of discipline, control, and cosmic order. The Golden Age was packed away like decorations after a festival, gone for now, but awaiting its return next year. For ordinary Romans, the aftermath carried hangovers, literal or metaphorical. Some returned reluctantly to routine, nursing sore heads and emptier purses after too many indulgences. Others seemed relieved, happy to restore social roles temporarily suspended. For slaves, Saturnalia was bittersweet, a fleeting taste of dignity and joy, followed by a return to servitude. Writers like Seneca remarked on the excesses, while others such as Macrobius explored the deeper significance. They understood that Saturnalia was more than indulgence. It reflected Rome's unique genius, upholding authority while permitting playful subversion, ruling an empire yet granting 1 week for chaos. Saturnalia never fully disappeared. Even after Christianity rose and the Western Empire fell, its spirit persisted, evolving into the foundations of modern winter holidays. Every civilization, no matter how orderly, needs a spark of chaos, and every calendar requires a week when the world tips upside down and laughs at itself. In the medieval era, there were no doctors on horseback or hospital wings stocked with linens. When a woman went into labor, whether in a peasant hut or a noble's chamber, the midwife was summoned, often in the dead of night, often with little notice, almost always facing life or death stakes. She was rarely licensed, seldom formally educated, and almost never paid her worth. Yet in her community, she was indispensable. Without her, childbirth could be fatal. In many villages, she might be the only experienced birth attendant, and even priests deferred to her knowledge when the screams began. She carried no diploma, only a satchel of herbs, oils, linens, and experience earned over years. Her training came from older midwives, family, or sheer repetition. She began as an assistant, passing cloths and holding hands, learning when to wait and when to act. Her classroom was the birthing mat. Her textbook was blood and breath. Her life was full of contradictions, honored yet feared, welcomed during sacred moments yet pushed aside amid suspicion. A healthy mother and child meant celebration. Stillbirth or hemorrhage could transform her from healer to scapegoat. People of the 1200s, 1400s did not understand germs or uterine rupture, but they understood blame. Still, the midwife endured, navigating superstition as deftly as complicated births. A charm against the evil eye here, a whispered prayer to Saint Margaret there. She might draw protective circles or place knives under the bed. Not exactly a believer in magic, but she used anything that might help. Always on call, with no rest or luxury, she faced urgency, sweat, and the quiet pressure of being the first to touch a new life or the last to see one depart. She was never the heroine but the anchor, uncredited yet unshakable. Becoming a midwife in the 13th or 14th century required hands-on learning rather than textbooks. Apprenticeship was through observation and experience. A young girl would shadow an older midwife, mother, aunt, or village elder, preparing the birthing room, stoking fires, boiling water, and laying out cloths. Then she watched closely as women labored, groaning, sweating, and screaming while life entered the world. It was raw, loud, bloody, and terrifying, not sanitized but real. For many young girls, that moment determined their path forever. If she stayed, she soon assisted directly, cleaning the newborn, tying the cord, applying herbs to the mother's torn flesh. Gradually, guided by the elder midwife, she learned to recognize danger, the subtle change in a mother's breathing before she fainted from blood loss, or the ominous silence signaling a baby had not yet cried. Knowledge was passed orally, not written, especially not in Latin, which most women could not read. Midwives shared lessons like folklore, wrapped in stories, warnings, and superstitions. Don't cut the cord until the afterbirth comes, one might say. Place rosemary under her pillow to keep away evil spirits. Each piece of advice had origins, and often, practical effects. Her first solo birth was a trial by fire. If the mother lived, the baby cried, and bleeding stopped, trust was earned. Technique alone was insufficient. A midwife needed courage, compassion, and calm when others panicked. Uncertainty was a luxury she could not afford. By the time she gained the village's acceptance, she had already held life in one hand and death in the other. Yet she returned to the next birth with chapped hands, aching joints, and eyes that had seen too much. Medieval midwives lacked scalpels, forceps, or antiseptic, but they carried vital tools. Her kit was modest, improvised, wielded with the quiet confidence of repeated use. It combined natural remedies, protective charms, and hard-earned instinct. Herbs were central: pain relievers, hemorrhage controllers, or labor stimulants, pennyroyal, mugwort, yarrow, and shepherd's purse. Boiled, ground, or burned, each plant had purpose. Swaddling cloths, sometimes soaked in vinegar or wine, helped disinfect. Oils, often olive or almond, eased tearing or massaged the belly. A small knife or shears cut the cord. If a newborn failed to breathe, she might suction mucus or swing it gently to elicit a cry. Charms and talismans were common: carved St. Margaret images, protective amulets, crosses etched into doorframes, or iron needles hidden in straw. Midwives relied on touch and positioning, feeling the baby's position, turning breech infants, or adjusting the mother to relieve pressure or restart stalled labor. There were no monitors or ultrasounds, only observation, intuition, and deep familiarity with the female body. Amid blood, fear, and screams, the midwife carried only what she could hold and remember, and it was enough. Medieval childbirth was harsh, unpredictable, and perilous. The midwife stood at the center, not as a controlling physician, but as guide and witness, steering two lives through peril with her hands and resolve. Labor took place in dim, smoky rooms, sometimes with fires blazing and windows closed to keep evil spirits away. Women gave birth squatting or on birthing stools, attended by female relatives, neighbors, and occasionally a servant. Men were typically excluded. The midwife ruled as quiet queen. She watched for subtle signs, breathing patterns, belly movement, expressions signaling contractions deepening. Silence warned of obstruction or excessive maternal bleeding. She acted swiftly, issuing firm directions while her hands worked. Successful births brought tears of relief and laughter. Complications demanded immediate intervention. Hemorrhages required packing rags, or even her own hand, into the womb. Babies not breathing might be rubbed, warmed, swung, or resuscitated with mouth-to-mouth, guided by tradition and urgency. Stillbirths and maternal deaths were common. In such cases, the midwife did not grieve openly. She cleaned the mother, wrapped the child, and offered prayers. Unbaptized infants might receive emergency baptism, sometimes with wine or saliva, defying church rules but preserving hope for the soul. Midwives were not miracle workers, but they battled blood, pain, and the shadow of death, and sometimes prevailed. That was enough. In the Middle Ages, life and death hung by a thread, most vividly in the hands of the midwife. The midwife's role extended beyond delivering babies. She sometimes performed baptisms, too. This placed her in a delicate position, part healer, part spiritual guardian, part potential scapegoat. The Church taught that unbaptized infants could not enter heaven, destined instead for limbo, separated from divine light. In towns where priests were miles away or unreachable on a winter night, the midwife was the only person able to act. If a newborn emerged blue or silent, she might sprinkle wine, water, or even her own saliva on its head, murmuring the sacred words, "I baptize thee in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost." Technically, only priests could perform baptisms, yet practically everyone looked the other way. Saving a soul mattered more than strict rules. Still, the midwife faced consequences. If the infant or mother died, suspicion often followed. Whispers questioned her choices. Did she use the wrong herbs? Delay the birth? Serve darker forces? The boundary between folk wisdom and witchcraft was perilously thin, because midwives relied on herbs, charms, and rituals not always approved by the Church. They were vulnerable. A woman who had saved many lives could become suspect after a single misfortune. If a baptism failed or was omitted, grieving families might respond with anger, reporting or punishing her. In superstitious communities, simply doing her job carried risk. Yet she persevered, focusing on what truly mattered: the sound of a living child, the rise and fall of a mother's chest, the sacred relief of life safely entering the world. The medieval midwife balanced life and death, faith and suspicion. On one side stood the church with priests, rituals, and male hierarchy. On the other, the midwife's folk knowledge, herbal lore, and women's collective wisdom. Knowledge was passed mother to daughter, unwritten but carefully observed. The church had mixed feelings. Midwives were indispensable. No male priest would deliver a peasant's child, but feared because they acted independently, managing births and baptisms, whispering prayers not always in Latin. Some dioceses imposed oaths: no magic, no abortions, no blasphemy. Others faced interrogation or denied communion if a child died under their care. Yet most midwives were not witches, only practical women helping mothers survive childbirth with available tools. They knew which herbs could end pregnancies or ease fevers, but they were not stirring cauldrons at midnight. They boiled water, tied cords, and confronted screams of labor. Accusations persisted. By the late 14th century, as witch fears grew, midwives' hands-on knowledge of female bodies made them targets, blamed for miscarriages, deformities, or infertility. Thus, the midwife navigated a careful path, crossing herself before placing charms, invoking saints while mixing herbs, ensuring all healing acts appeared as prayer. She delivered babies while protecting herself from suspicion. In a society where women were largely invisible, the birthing room was one of the few places they ruled. Men were excluded unless emergencies arose. In cramped, heated spaces, whether in a peasant's hut or noble chamber, the midwife presided over a women-centered world, held together by pain, prayer, and companionship. Birth was communal. A circle of female relatives, neighbors, or local healers assisted, holding the mother, massaging, offering hot cloths, whispering encouragement, or singing lullabies. At the center, the midwife directed, guided, and commanded with quiet authority. She could shout over screams, slap a panicking woman, or demand more hot water, yet also soothe with a glance, story, or one charm passed hand to hand. This circle of women was practical and spiritual armor. Labor was dangerous and could be fatal. Familiar faces helped the mother stay grounded. Midwives sometimes led prayers, chants, or protective rituals, tying ribbons, lighting candles, or pouring wine to appease spirits. When the baby arrived, wet, crying, alive, celebration spread beyond the mother. The circle rejoiced, wept, crossed themselves, laughed, and shared bread and ale if all had gone well. In a world where women rarely held authority, the birthing room was a rare domain of female power. The midwife was its guardian, protecting not just the child, but the bonds between women, forged through generations of shared knowledge, whispered secrets, and fierce care. Being a medieval midwife was not a calling born of privilege. It was grueling, thankless, often unpaid, or compensated with bread, chickens, or promises. Yet for many women, it offered one of the few ways to gain respect, purpose, and a modest livelihood in a society that denied them almost everything else. Most midwives were not noblewomen. They were peasants, tradeswomen, or widows who earned reputations through years of service. In towns, some gained local fame, occasionally appointed as official parish midwives. In villages, they were treated as half-healer, half-helper, summoned whenever needed. Payment was irregular. In wealthier towns, some received small coins or gifts of wine, wool, or candles. More often, it was a promise: a chicken at harvest, bread from the next bake. If mother or child died, the promise vanished, or worse, turned into accusations or cold silence. Despite this, a skilled midwife gained quiet power, respected, feared, and relied upon. Women trusted her more than any priest, especially during labor. Avoiding scandal and building a record of successful births, she became woven into village life, the one whispered about with awe and called even before labor began. By the late 1300s, some cities began formalizing midwifery. In France and parts of Germany, midwives were occasionally examined or licensed by male physicians or clerics, a mix of medicine and moral oversight. Still, they were rarely paid well. Status was symbolic, risk remained real. And yet, despite exhaustion, irregular income, and constant suspicion, midwives continued. They worked not for coin, but because no one else could, and because each healthy birth, each newborn's first cry, was a small, sacred victory that belonged to them alone. The life of a medieval midwife rarely ended with recognition. No statues honored her, no books bore her name. Yet for centuries, she quietly safeguarded life, guiding generations with worn hands and weathered wisdom, disappearing as silently as she arrived. Many died poor and anonymous, without formal training, titles, or surviving family. Their stories endured only in parish records, court documents, or whispered memory. Some were buried with gratitude, their herbs and tools passed to apprentices. Others were forgotten, or remembered only for alleged misdeeds in later years. Still, their impact echoed silently. Every woman who survived childbirth, every swaddled infant, owed life to one of these women. Each newborn first felt the hands of a midwife, hands that had delivered dozens, perhaps hundreds, before. Their knowledge, unwritten but enduring, passed through generations, which herbs to use, prayers to whisper, positions to try when labor stalled. The church may have tried to control them, physicians may have dismissed them, but women remembered. By the 15th century, formal medicine began to assert control. Male doctors entered birthing rooms, and midwifery, once fully female, was redefined by men with degrees in Latin terminology. Many midwives were pushed aside, sometimes literally, sometimes by law. In later centuries, the midwife became both romanticized and erased. But in the 1200s to 1400s, she remained at the center of the storm, moving through blood, fear, superstition, and screams, bringing new life into the world, not by history's invitation, but by life's necessity. Though most names are lost, we remember their quiet, repeated, courageous work.